We don't think it's unreasonable for a country or a state or a county or a province or a city or a town or even a family in a home to ask two questions. Who are you and where are you from? And considering the context of the war on terror, we don't think that's an unreasonable provision or a goal to pursue.
Okay, but then in context of the war on terror, we're not necessarily talking about Mexican immigrants or people from Latin America. We're talking about people that might give credence to the argument made by those who oppose this legislation that you're really engaged in racial profiling.
Well, and I would certainly be aware that our porous border is an avenue into the country for terrorist extremists. So I think that's verified through our investigators down there. But in the issue of racial profiling...
Verified in what way, if I might ask you?
Oh, we have hand grenades coming into our state, into our city from Eastern Europe. And they're coming up through the Mexican border. Even from Asia, our investigators tell us that weapons and arms are coming up through the Mexican border into Arizona. So I think the threat is real, but I think what's just as real is the fact that Arizona has a history of partnering with our minority communities. So racial profiling, even though it's a reality, it's never been a problem. We have successfully interacted and partnered with our minority communities in Arizona, and specifically Phoenix as a whole. Past history is a good indicator of future performance.
Okay, but I mean, if we can just go back to the war on terror for a second, I mean, Mexico and northern Mexico is in the middle of a terrible drug war, which is taking many lives and ruining thousands of other lives across the border from the United States. And it's all about drugs which are going into North America. Is that not a more immediate concern for people such as yourselves rather than the war on terror?
Well, and I think the common denominator here, whether you call it a war on terror or a war on drugs, the common term is a war. Wherever there's war, there's a loss of physical life, there's danger, there's an absence of the rule of law. It's spilling in to Arizona. It's killing our ranchers. It's killing our cops. It's damaging our minority community partners. We needed to be proactive, and we'll continue to be proactive in partnering with our federal partners over at ICE.
Okay, let me ask you, if this law had gone into effect in its entirety tomorrow, would we have seen on the streets of Arizona an immediate increase in the numbers of people detained by law enforcement officers?
No, absolutely not. And what we've been doing for the past 2 years in Phoenix is test driving this law, Senate Bill 1070, through our revised Phoenix immigration policy. And in the last 2 years, those provisions have been maintained by the judge. In the last 2 years, we've been able to partner with ICE and facilitate over 3,000 illegal aliens deported without any additional cost or crime, without any drain on manpower, and without a single civil rights, racial profiling, or biased policing complaint. But in other words, we've had an impact on 1% of the illegal population in Phoenix, and we've seen a 24% reduction in violent crime. That's a great success.
But you would have seen, presumably, a need, because this is the law you supported that's been partially blocked today, the right to stop people suspected of committing another crime and ask them where they're from and where they have their papers. That presumably is to help the broken system, as it's often referred to in Arizona, in terms of immigration.
Well, I think the judge clearly struggled with that part, but what we've been doing the last 2 years is maintained in the statute. And what also is maintained in the statute through the judge is that cities or departments cannot have restrictive policies. They need to allow and facilitate discretionary contact with local law enforcement with ICE. That's still in the bill, and the penalty for engaging in restrictive policies is still in the bill. That's crucial.
Okay, so in a sense, one gets the impression that while you would have supported the bill in its entirety, you can still work with the legislation on the ground.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay. Like I said, we've been test driving that for 2 years quite successfully.
Let me then go on to another point, because there are those, obviously, many people, it's claimed in Arizona, who support this bill, maybe not the finer details, but really supporting it because they believe the Obama administration or the federal government in Washington isn't doing enough about the immigration problem in their state. As a law enforcement officer who would now be obliged, certainly, to ask somebody where they were from had this legislation gone through, what would you say as president of the Police Federation to those police officers who would have had a crisis of conscience in doing that?
Well, I guess my thought process to communicate to law enforcement officers, not only in Arizona but nationwide, is we took an oath. We took an oath to enforce the law, and it's very similar. What would happen to a reporter that failed to report the news? At least you don't even take an oath.
I mean,
but
that's
law
a very broad
enforcement
stroke,
officers
with
take
all
an
due
oath.
respect. I mean, I get the comparison to a certain degree, but, you know, you're painting with a very broad brush here. If there is a law officer who comes across somebody who he thinks maybe suspects is committing a crime, but because of a crisis of conscience chooses not to ask them where they're from, even though he might believe they're from south of the border, what would your law enforcement operation do?
Well, we value our freedom, and every person values their freedom, and certainly when you take an oath, you make a commitment to enforce the law. But an officer who struggles with enforcing the law is free. He or she is free to find another job. And I think taxpayers and citizens, we risk our lives to enforce the rule of law. We took a commitment, a serious commitment, with our lives and our health to do that. And we need to maintain that commitment and that oath.
So your Phoenix law enforcement agency wouldn't necessarily support a police officer who had that crisis of conscience, or perhaps feared that he might be sued by the people he'd arrested?
Well, and the statute as it is written alleviates any fear or liability on individual officers in reference to illegal immigration. That's directed at policies and departments. If there is willful misconduct, the officer will always be liable. But if it's according to a policy, that department is going to be liable.
All right, Mark Spencer, thanks very much indeed for joining us from Phoenix, Arizona.